Good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning on the 10-minute concept call. Rick asked me to share with you today. But most of you know me on this call as in kind of two different roles. But for over 30 years, I served as a producer, building a practice, sitting around kitchen tables, navigating objections, solving real problem challenges. For the last 3 years, I've had the privilege of serving in advisory relations here at CAMS, helping advisors to case design, advanced planning, concepts, strategic, to help with complex strategy conversations. What many people don't realize is that much of my success over 4 decades was shaped by something outside of the office. Excuse me. It was general aviation. Airplanes weren't a hobby, they were tools. They allowed me to serve clients across the Western United States and communities that required intention to reach. They allowed me to show up, and over time, I realized aviation wasn't just transportation, it really was training. So it shaped how I prepared, how I assessed risk, how I listened, how I introduced advanced strategies, and most importantly, how I learned to wait. Because in both aviation and advisory work, timing is everything. So, what I'm about to share with you is a story that I wrote about in a chapter 14 of my upcoming book called Beyond the Runway. Not because it was dramatic, but because it captures something aviation taught me that no sales training ever could. Here's something aviation teaches you that no CE class ever will. Weather does not negotiate. You can't persuade a storm. You cannot rush a crosswind. You can't reason for low ceilings, but you can have the aircraft fueled. You can have the flight plan. You can have a full day of client meetings scheduled, and still you wait because no amount of urgency overrides conditions. Every client I served, they knew I was coming in to see them. But I always told them up front, just so you know, I fly myself, and occasionally weather controls my schedule. I planned ahead, I built margin into my calendar, but there were mornings, especially in the Northwest, when I would wake up at 4:30 a.m., pull the weather briefing, and immediately know, not today. Ceilings were too low, or mountains passes were obscured, or icing risk was building, crosswinds outside my margin. Technically, could I pushed it? Maybe. But aviation teaches you this. Just because something isn't possible doesn't make it wise. So I would make the call. I would cancel. I would reschedule. And here's what's interesting. In over 3 decades of flying to serve clients, not once did that create frustration. Not once did it create friction. Why? Because they knew why I was waiting. They knew I wasn't being careless. They knew I wasn't being inconsistent. They knew that I was being responsible, and that responsibility builds trust. More than once, a client would say to me, I'm glad you made that call. I'd rather you be safe. That moment matters because what they're really saying is, I care more about you arriving safely than you arriving quickly. The mission isn't departure. The mission is arrival. It's waiting is not weakness, it's discipline. The inexperienced pilot sees delay as inconvenience. The experienced pilot sees delay as a judgment. This parallels advisory work more than people realize. Some of the emotional weather in a client meeting isn't ready. Sometimes it shows up as guarded adult children, past negative experience with advisors, fear of losing control, deep seated mistrust or family tension just below the surface, and you can feel it. Technically, you could still present the strategy. You could open an illustration. You could diagram the CRT. You could explain the eyelet, and you can show tax savings, but conditions aren't right. And if you depart into emotional weather that isn't ready, you don't create lift, you create turbulence. In aviation, impatient risks safety. In advisory work, impatient risks trust. Some of the most profitable decisions I ever made were flights that I didn't take. One of the most impactful, or some of them actually, of the most impactful cases I ever designed were strategies I did not introduce at the first meeting because waiting clarifies. Weather systems move, ceilings lift, visibility improves, and when they do, Your departure is smooth, your climb is clean, and your arrival is calm. So that's exactly what happened with Betty. Betty was a client of mine for a number of years. I met Betty through her son Fred. He was a pastor in Moses Lake, Washington. When I first sat down with her at her kitchen table, two 6-inch binders sat in front of me, meticulously organized, tabbed, labeled, paper municipal bond certificates, mostly general obligation bonds, some revenue bonds, held outside custodial accounts. To an advisor, that structure may say, wow, organized on the surface, but underneath, paper assets would complicate settlement, heavy concentration in one area, and no coordinated plan for how the next chapter of income would actually work. Here's what stood out. She wasn't asking about performance. She wasn't focused on yield. She had achieved security. Now she wanted meaning. That first meeting was not warm. Her son John stood nearby with his arms crossed. I could still see him today. He didn't say much, but he communicated everything. Don't steer my mother wrong. Low ceilings, crosswinds, not unsafe, but just not ready. If I had opened those binders and immediately proposed restructuring strategies, I would have confirmed every fear in that room. Instead, I said something simple. I'm not here to sell anything. I'm here to understand what Betty wants the remaining years of her life to look like. And then I stopped talking and I listened. What surfaced wasn't a rate problem. It wasn't efficiency. It wasn't ladder optimization. It wasn't about performance. It was about transition. She wanted to bless her children wisely, support the causes that she cared about, and enjoy her remaining years with dignity and shift from accumulation to intentional distribution. You don't uncover that if you lead with strategy. You uncover it if you wait. Serving Betty meant flying. Southern Oregon to Moses Lake, Washington, then south to Hemet, nearly to the Mexican border. Those miles, they weren't efficient. They certainly weren't scalable, but they were intentionally. On final approach into Hemet, I could see beyond the runway threshold, and I knew who was at the other end, Betty. On arrival days, Betty would sit by her window. She told me once that when she heard the engine on final approach, she would smile. Without fail, she would climb into her silver 1989 Ford Tempo, barely 6,500 miles in nearly 15 years, and drive to the airport to pick me up herself. That car barely moved, but when it did, it mattered. We would sit in a small airport cafe and we didn't talk portfolios. We talked about life. She wasn't waiting for a pitch, she was waiting for someone who cared enough to come back. That image stayed with me long enough that I wrote the full story in chapter 14 of my book, Beyond the Runway, because finishing well matters more than taking off fast. Over time, John's arms folded soft. They softened up his grip. Quick questions replaced skepticism. Trust cleared the runway. And when it did, strategy performed beautifully. Now we could reorganize her municipal holdings, reducing estate friction, coordinating income more efficiently, aligning her charitable intent, and introducing more advanced planning tools. Introduced too early, resistance. Introduced at the right time, relief. And here's where this connects to what we do at Camus. We have extraordinary planning capability. CRTs, ILITs, tax coordination, estate alignment, strategic repositioning, but advanced planning must be introduced at the right altitude. Leading with tools too soon, you can create headwinds. Leading with listening first, and you create lift. When the emotional runway is clear, we step in together. We design the structure, we coordinate the complexity, we build the strategy. But it works because trust landed first. So as you think about your next complex case, before you introduce a strategy, before you diagram the trust, before you run the numbers, ask yourself one question. Is the emotional runway clear? Because when trust lands first, advanced planning becomes welcome, not resisted. And that's when we don't just design cases, we change outcomes. So I want to thank you for joining me today. Have a great rest of your day.